It's 8:30 in the morning here in the capital, Tehran. You're watching another bulletin of world news on Press TV. Many thanks for joining us this hour. Well, Canada's Indigenous protest movement, IdleNoMore, vows to continue action until Ottawa respects the rights of its Aboriginal people.
At the end of the day, this is...
Well, a group of protesters temporarily blocked a road in Oakville, Ontario, near a Ford assembly plant where Prime Minister Stephen Harper was speaking. Minutes later, Harper announced that he had agreed to meet with Canada's Native leaders next week. However, protest organizers stressed the need for continued action. Protests have erupted across the country over the course of the 25-day hunger strike of Theresa Spence, one of the leaders of Canada's First Nations. Spence has said in a statement that she will remain on hunger strike until January the 11th meeting promised by Prime Minister Stephen Harper. Well, joining us now from Calgary, Canada, via Skype is our correspondent Joshua Blakeney to tell us a bit more. Joshua, how much of a victory is this in itself that Prime Minister Stephen Harper has finally acknowledged these protests and agreed to hold talks?
I think it's celebrated by the Aboriginal leadership as a necessary first step if there's going to be any palliatives reached for the grave situation of Canada's Aboriginal peoples. Of course, Aboriginal peoples in Canada, young Aboriginals are more likely to end up in prison than graduate high school. There are many statistics showing that Aboriginal peoples have been getting short shrift in comparison to the rest of Canadian society. I remember in 2010 that James Cameron, the famous film director, flew into Alberta, where I reside, where there's the third largest oil reserves in the world, and referred to the development of Canadian resources as being comparable to a gold rush. And that's how the Aboriginal peoples view it too. They're asking, why is it that Canada has such an abundance of resources, and yet none of that wealth is being distributed fairly and equitably to the Indigenous people of this country? Moreover, there's evidently systemic racism in this country when you look at the way, for example, the police tend to treat Aboriginal peoples, quite often willing to throw them in jail and sort of deem them guilty until proven innocent rather than the opposite. And so there's many problems, and I've just mentioned a few of those, that the Aboriginal peoples would like to see overcome. And the fact that they're coming to the table and reasonably asking for a discussion with the Prime Minister rather than advocating violence shows the sincerity of the Aboriginal leadership. The question will become, will the Harper government respond in a constructive way, or will he continue to be perceived to be in the pocket of the very resource companies which the Indigenous peoples are saying are effectively plundering their Indigenous wealth? And so that will be the question. Will the government respond? Of course, the conservative parties in all Western societies, in Britain and Australia, and also in this country, are perceived to be the party of the rich, and the parties that tend to prioritize the interests of the well-heeled in society. And the Aboriginal peoples in our society tend to be marginalized, not well-heeled. And so the question will become, will the Harper government do a volte-face and turn around and begin to help the Indigenous people?
Indeed, Joshua, that does bring me to my next question. What does Stephen Harper come with when he comes to the negotiating table? What does he have to offer, considering his government's policies have been ones that have made already a persecuted community even worse from where it was?
Well, that's yet to be seen. Thus far, it's not exactly pleasing from the perspective of the Indigenous peoples. Canada has a history of treaty negotiations, which is quite a good history, I would say, in Canada's history, where traditionally the imperial crown sought to strike treaties with the Indigenous peoples, and many Indigenous peoples kind of hold these pieces of paper up, just as we see sort of Palestinians holding the keys to their houses in Palestine up, as being symbolic of their Indigenous rights. And so we have these treaties that were agreed to between the Crown and the Indigenous peoples, and the Indigenous peoples allege that the Canadian government isn't respecting those treaties, which they consider to be legal documents. And the Canadian Constitution says it's supposed to be the supreme law of Canada to respect these Aboriginal rights, to affirm the treaty rights. And yet we don't see that happening in practice. 99% of the historic territories of the original peoples of Canada have been taken from them. And now whenever there's a diamond mine to be mined or oil resources to be extracted, the indigenous peoples tend to be, shifted aside, and the mining companies and resource companies are brought in. And that has been the kind of emphasis of the Harper government. And so the indigenous leadership will be looking for a marked change in the Harper government's approach to Aboriginal relations in this country. And that's yet to be seen.
Okay, we'll keep a very close eye on the situation there in Canada as it develops. Our correspondent Joshua Blakeney standing by in Calgary there. Joshua, thank you for that update there.